We've got two great talks for us this afternoon, evening, depending on where you are, to kind of continue to spark our creativity and get us thinking about questions in synthesis and ecology. So I'm happy to introduce the first speaker, which is Dr. Jessica Gurevitch, who's from Stony Brook University. She's going to be addressing some of the challenges with cross-disciplinary synthesis, the nature of generality, and meta-analysis for parameter estimation in the context of big data and open science. So thank you, and take it away, Jessica.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being here to listen. And unlike the first two talks, I'm not going to talk so much about specific systems, but more just about ideas I've been thinking about, and hope some of them will be ideas that you would like to think about and discuss as well. So the first question is, okay, the topic of this symposium is the future of synthesis and ecology. So, so what are we looking for? What are the goals of synthesis? Are we thinking about integrating things? Are we thinking about generality? Are we looking for mixtures or mosaics or monocultures, or what do we do about heterogeneity? And are we hoping for homogeneity? How do we deal with noise? One way of thinking about this is, are we thinking about a goal of fruit salad with lots of chunks of nice different kinds of fruits? Or are we thinking of applesauce where it's all cooked down and, blended together? Is this going to be many courses or a one-pot meal? So there's an old question in ecology, which is, are there rules? And this goes back to, I don't know, maybe the 60s or 70s, where people were saying, are there rules in ecology? In more recent years, we've been asking, and some of the discussion this morning was about whether we can make generalizations in ecology, or alternatively, is ecology a collection of case studies? That's something that Dan Simberloff and others have argued. Ecology is just a collection of case studies. We can't generalize, we can't synthesize. I disagree with that very strongly, but I won't go into a long rant about why I think ecology is not just a collection of case studies. And in fact, if it is a collection just of case studies, then I would argue it's not science. Okay, so what's the big problem here? The 800-pound gorilla in the room is heterogeneity. Ecologists find heterogeneity everywhere. And we have heterogeneity at every scale. We have heterogeneity across spatial scales, temporal scales, conceptual scales, within scales, across scales. There's heterogeneity everywhere. So by conceptual scales, I mean things like trophic levels, or things like going from landscapes to regions. Every way we look at it, there's heterogeneity. So what do we want to do? Do we want to get rid of the heterogeneity? We want to wipe it out? Do we want to combine or synthesize so that we eliminate heterogeneity? Do we want to embrace heterogeneity? What do we want to do? How do we want to deal with this? We see it everywhere. Right. What are we going to do? Okay, I would say no. No, we don't want to get rid of heterogeneity because, well, I don't think we can get rid of it. And I think heterogeneity can be important and interesting. And I think that part of synthesis and part of the aim of generalizing is to, we have to deal with heterogeneity. Okay, so at what level do we want to generalize results? One of the things people have confronted in recent times is that studies may be publishable only if they differ in important ways from other studies. Are they novel? So if you're reviewing a paper for publication as a peer reviewer, one of the things they ask you about is this novel? And if every study is novel, then how can we generalize across studies? And how can we replicate results, right? This is a lot of the emphasis of open science, is that we have to be able to have replication if we're going to this is going to be science. We have to be able to replicate, but how can we do that if every study is publishable only if it's novel and different from all the other studies? So is each plot, each community, each system uniquely different? When are the differences across scales important? And what might be lost when we synthesize? So we're all here talking about we want to synthesize, but well, maybe some things are lost when we synthesize. Maybe synthesis is appropriate some of the time and helpful some of the time, but information is lost when you synthesize also. If we generalize for understanding things at a larger scale, if we're generalizing across heterogeneity, when are we risking combining apples and oranges? Or alternatively, when are we trying to understand fruit? This is a riff off a famous quote in the meta-analysis literature. Sometimes it's a good thing to combine apples and oranges because we're trying to understand fruit. But then if you're worried about combining apples and oranges, maybe each type of apple and each different kind of orange is so distinct that we lose important information when we synthesize them into applesauce. So what can we do about heterogeneity? So here are some things I would suggest, some things I would recommend. First of all, we want to explain heterogeneity whenever we can explain it. So there are times where heterogeneity can be explained, where it makes sense, where it adds to the dimensionality and the understanding of whatever it is we're trying to explain. Are the explainable portions of the heterogeneity the same across scales? And I would argue often they're not. So there may be heterogeneity you can explain at one spatial scale, for example, or at one trophic level, at one conceptual scale. But that heterogeneity is really different at other scales. And what we can explain at the different scales may be very different. So if that's the case, what are the meaningful explanations at each scale? Are there causal factors? So you may have heterogeneity in your system, and you may be able to explain it because temperature is an important causal factor. Nitrogen is an important causal factor. The degree of herbivory may be driving things. So if we have important causal factors that we can identify, that can help us to explain some of the heterogeneity at some of the scales. There may be trends. The trends may exist over space, they may exist over time. Maybe climate change is a really important driver of something that we're trying to explain. So we have a trend over time. We may have abiotic gradients that are important. Is that heterogeneity in different places or at different scales? Is it just random noise? Or an alternative, if you're thinking statistically, well, sort of statistically and ecologically both, heterogeneity may be due to meaningful factors that can't be generalized. So for example, just something I might picture is the patterns of shade in a particular forest may be very different from one little spot to another. You can't really generalize it. It makes sense. It's meaningful. We understand the ecological basis of that heterogeneity, but it's not generalizable. It's not generalizable to other scales or other systems or other fields or other forests because it's unique to that particular case. So that's a different thing. There are two different things at issue here. There may be heterogeneity that's just random, that we have no explanation for. And sometimes heterogeneity, we can explain it, but it's not generalizable. So here's an example of how different factors may be operating at different spatial scales. A study that I have been working on for some time is on the invasion of spotted knapweed, Centaurea stobi, in the northeastern US. And there's a picture of this lovely, nasty, invasive plant. And in a paper with my former student, now a postdoc in Canada, Maura Delua Akinfajia, what we found was that there were different factors driving this invasion, which is, it's relatively newly invasive in the northeastern US. It's been invasive in the western US for a long time. So at different spatial scales, different factors were important in driving this invasion. Climate and soils were the most important factors when you looked at what was driving the invasion across the entire northeastern US. Precipitation and disturbance were the most important factors at regional scales, and so on. So at local scales, regional scales, and across the entire northeastern US, different factors were driving this invasion. And also different factors explained differences in the occurrence, whether the that species was present or not, the density and the change in density, the population growth, all of those things were driven by, those outcomes were driven by different factors as well. So what do we mean by synthesis? Do we mean combining everything? Well, that wouldn't be so good here, right? We want to be able to explain how occurrence, density, and change in density they're different properties of these populations, and they're being driven by different factors, and different factors are operating at different spatial scales. So we want to get an overall picture, but do we want to take apart the patterns and drivers at different scales? Do we want to synthesize them? Do we want to combine them? These are questions to wrestle with when we're thinking about synthesis. So, when is it appropriate to synthesize? When is it appropriate to seek generalization? When is it most meaningful? When is meaning lost by synthesis? Are we risking lumping so many things together that the results and conclusions don't make sense anymore? Or can we extract meaningful generalizations? And like so many things in ecology, I think we don't really find yes or no answers or black and white kind of conclusions. It's more a question of when and under what constraints and what conditions and what circumstances, when do we expect syntheses to be most meaningful? And the answers depend both on the structure and nature of the data, and they also depend on the questions that we're asking. So what kinds of information should we aim to synthesize? Well, one of the things I think is really important, and I really wanted to emphasize this when I looked at the questions and that large spreadsheet, is what makes our field science? So some of the things that people are thinking about are science and some are not. And I really want to emphasize that we want to talk about this as science. Can syntheses better use the FAIR scientific principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? And I would remind all of us that science is one way of understanding the world. It's a very powerful way of understanding the world. I think it's an unnatural way, and that's why it takes so long to learn how to be a scientist. It's not a natural way of thinking. It's a really powerful way of thinking. But it's not the only way to understand the world in a meaningful way. Art, myth, belief, magical thinking, all of these have important roles in the human experience, but they're not science. If what we are doing is to remain scientific, information must be gathered, analyzed, and synthesized in a repeatable, rational, logical, transparent, and rigorous manner. It has to rely on evidence. It has to be testable. So science is immensely powerful, but we know that it has limitations. It could be used for good, it could be used for evil, and it has been used for both. It is subjective in subtle or blatant ways. And of course, science can incorporate all sorts of biases because science is a human endeavor, and science is carried out by scientists who are people. All right, so the role of research synthesis. Research synthesis is the application of the scientific method to reviewing the evidence from the literature, published or unpublished literature. It includes meta-analysis and systematic reviews. And current practice is to make the methods that are used in literature reviews just as much scientific, repeatable, and transparent as the work that we do when we're doing primary studies. And the goal of modern research synthesis is to summarize what we know about a given question, or in medicine, you might say a given intervention. What is the effect of the Moderna immunization on transmissibility of the coronavirus? You know, that's an intervention kind of question. And we have more broad questions in ecology. Systematic reviews and meta-analysis are part of the developing science of research synthesis. And I say developing because more consistent standards are necessary for progress. On the left is a picture of a graph with the growth of research synthesis across all disciplines, going to something like 250,000 studies. This is from a paper I published with several of my colleagues, Julia Koracheva, Shinichi Nakagawa, and Gavin Stewart in 2018. And we talked a lot about the nature of research synthesis. And on the right is a paper that is in press by Rose O'Day and many collaborators. And what you can see is that the reporting quality is kind of meh. So these are for research syntheses. And what in this paper is proposed is a set of guidelines, analogy to the PRISMA guidelines that are used in other disciplines, PRISMA, ECO, for authors, reviewers, and editors to improve the quality of research syntheses, formal research syntheses in the literature. Okay, another question. I'm going to try to go, I always go too slowly and have too many things to cram in, but okay, I will try my best. So can meta-analysis help with interdisciplinary synthesis? Meta-analysis has been used across a very wide range of scales and scope in ecology, but in contrast, in clinical medicine and in animal medical studies, meta-analysis and research synthesis and systematic reviews are always used for narrow, very highly defined, very specific evaluation of interventions under very specific conditions. And what sacrifices generality. In ecology, we often sacrifice specificity for generality at the cost of heterogeneity. Synthesis across disciplines is therefore very challenging, and there's a large learning curve because people think very differently and the kinds of questions they ask are very different in these different fields, and what seems appropriate is very different in different fields. So we can learn a great deal from each other about both approaches and results. And this is a study that I was involved with in oh my goodness, back in the old days when we used to travel places, this was done with a group that spent a week in a chalet in the Swiss Alps and came up with this paper. Boy, was that paradise. And people fed us wonderful food. Anyway, I digress. So the message from this paper is that embracing heterogeneity and designing studies to account for heterogeneity and research syntheses in animal experiments in medicine is likely to lead to much better results than we've had so far, and to overcome problems that have been plaguing this field for a long time. So this is incorporating ecological and evolutionary thinking in a very different field, these animal studies. So how can we synthesize ideas, questions, and results across disciplines? And what if our questions are inherently interdisciplinary? And here's a paper that is also about to come out. It is going to come out in the next week or so. So this paper is entitled Potential Ecological Impacts of Climate Intervention, also known as geoengineering, by reflecting sunlight to cool Earth. And this is a group of climate scientists and ecologists that are working together to answer an inherently interdisciplinary question. It's not a meta-analysis. This is a conceptual paper. But the idea here is that broader tolerance among disciplines for different kinds of questions is essential for cross-disciplinary syntheses, where Both the specific effects of more narrowly defined scope as well as meta-analyses that incorporate high heterogeneity are used to answer more general questions, and where people are trying to work together to answer questions that require understanding in both disciplines or several different disciplines, but where the way we think about things, the words we use, the questions we ask, the answers that seem satisfying may be really different in the different fields. Here's another example. Earth system models are increasingly combining climate data with data on ecosystem responses. But the parameter estimates that go into these Earth system models seem to be, from what I could tell, they seem to be made arbitrarily, haphazardly, and certainly opaquely. So could meta-analysis of existing data be used to integrate climate and ecological data more scientifically in establishing parameters for model input? And there's a little asterisk here because I have nothing to cite. It hasn't been formally done yet. So those of you who are thinking about ways that you can do something that's really important, useful, and novel, here's a great opportunity. Making use of formal meta-analysis procedures can offer more precise, replicable, and transparent parameter estimation for Earth system models. Okay, what about big data? In the era of big data, domination by computer science and computer scientists rather than statistics has overlooked many statistical issues, including formal research synthesis methodology. How can the reporting, locating, analysis, and use of data be made more scientific, more transparent, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? And if we can achieve that, will that make cross-disciplinary work more accessible? And I'd say, maybe. But there are many other barriers. The questions may be different. What is considered legitimate science? What is meaningful? What's an advance over current knowledge? And this is kind of jokingly, do we drink beer or wine or shots? Meaning we may have very different culture in different fields. How will science influence the availability and collection of data for future meta-analyses, or will it? So we have, okay, open science is going to solve all our problems. Well, metadata and data reporting standards are very far from that at present in ecology. Some recent trends very quickly. Developments in research synthesis that may advance interdisciplinarity, analysis across scales or systems and reach in new directions, better methods for imputation for missing information. So this is a paper that recently came out by Stephen Kumbach and colleagues on multiple imputation for missing standard deviations and sample sizes, a big problem in ecological meta-analysis. Advances in AI approaches for searching and selecting data systematically. Network meta-analysis is a very, very big area in medical meta-analysis and research synthesis, but probably of somewhat limited use in ecology. But the meta-analysis of networks has not been done much at all. A recently finished PhD student, Nicole Kinlock of mine, published a paper back in 2019 in which she constructed networks within studies and then did a meta-analysis combining these plant interaction networks to reveal new understanding about the plant communities. Advances in meta-regression as well can be important, but have huge challenges. So summary, research synthesis is a scientific undertaking. It must follow the scientific method. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses are important aspects of research synthesis. In ecology, heterogeneity exists at every scale, and one of the grand challenges and advances in synthesis is finding the right balance between generalization and accounting for heterogeneity. And I'll just wrap up. Cross-disciplinary integration and synthesis is essential where the questions and phenomena are inherently interdisciplinary, but it is very challenging, fun, but challenging. So, okay, is it all right to combine mangoes and mangoes? There are a lot of different kinds of mangoes. Thank you, and thanks to my students and colleagues for fruitful discussions, and to NSF for funding.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We're going to hold questions until after the next talk, but that was a very insightful and thought-provoking presentation, so thank you very much. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Michael Dietze from Boston University, and he's going to be discussing the role of prediction in driving synthesis and advancing ecological understanding, detailing how an iterative cycle of prediction and synthesis provides a critical win-win of simultaneously improving environmental decision-making and sustainability while accelerating basic research. So thank you, Mike. Take it away.
Did I get the screen sharing right?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. I always worry that I'm sharing the wrong screen. Yes, so prediction, predictability, and emerging imperatives. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to argue that the future of synthesis, needs to include iterative prediction as part of how we do synthesis. As iterative prediction addresses both an imperative need to improve environmental decision-making and grand challenge scientific questions about the patterns of predictability in ecology. I'll wrap up the talk at the end by introducing some of our efforts to build a community of practice around prediction in ecology. So why am I talking about a prediction in a session on synthesis? The way that most of us have been taught in terms of modeling and statistics usually presents synthesis and prediction as two very separate activities, with synthesis occurring first and efforts at prediction occurring second, if at all. They're the notoriously last chapter of a dissertation that never gets done. I'm going to argue this dichotomy only exists when we're viewing synthesis and prediction as a one-time effort. By contrast, I think this distinction goes away when we view science as a continuous iterative process of making predictions and then confronting those predictions with data. In this perspective, synthesis becomes a continuous process of updating our understanding as new information becomes available. Indeed, I argue that iterative forecasting is a particularly strong expression of the scientific method that forces us to test hypotheses that are quantitative, specific, and therefore falsifiable. I'm also going to say that models play a critical role in prediction, whether these are sophisticated computer simulation models or simple statistical ones or machine learning approaches, and that model data assimilation techniques allow us to use models as scaffolds for combining and synthesizing multiple sources of data across different scales and different processes. This animation gives an example of what I'm talking about. When I talk about iterative forecasts, I really can mean things as quickly as phenological forecasts run on a daily basis that are assimilating new information every day from multiple sources, both the field and satellites, and making new predictions that are updated continuously. I'll also say that in our current era of rapid environmental change, where transient conditions have become the new normal, there's a critical need for ecologists to better inform environmental decision-making. I'll also say that decisions are fundamentally about what we think is going to happen in the future under different decision choices, the status quo, option A, option B, and that thus ecological forecasts can provide explicit predictions about those alternative futures that can represent our best synthetic understanding of ecological processes. Unfortunately, a lot of the recent modeling and prediction effort in ecology is focused on timescales that are longer than what most stakeholders actually need to do effective decision making, and also longer than is really useful for iteratively testing our predictions against new data. And I say this as someone who spent a lot of their career making predictions under climate change scenarios, that I've, after decades of doing so, I've never learned if I'm any better at making predictions to 2100 than when I started, because I've never been to 2100 to test if I'm any good at that. Now, the argument that ecological forecasts address an imperative need that we make our science more relevant to society is not a new argument. It was actually central to Clark's seminal paper from 2001, introducing ecological forecasting 20 years ago. I'll say, but what is new is our ability to do something about it. In the last 20 years, we've seen a revolution in sensor technologies, the rise of large-scale coordinated research networks and observation networks. We've seen an explosion in both Earth observation data and community science. And as Ben mentioned at the start of the day, we've also seen a revolution in not only our underlying information technology, but also in our norms and expectations about data sharing and open science that makes this sort of real-time science and real-time prediction really feasible in a way today that it hasn't been previously. There are undoubtedly challenges ahead of us if we're going to achieve this win-win of driving ecology towards being a more robust and predictive science, while at the same time better responding to societal needs. And while some of these challenges are technological, I think the biggest bottleneck is actually a mental shift in perspective of putting prediction at the center of our science. So if we look at weather forecasting as an example, 60 years of experience has shown that accurate prediction of complex nonlinear systems is indeed possible. It has also shown us that getting good at forecasting doesn't come all at once. It doesn't come the instant we get a better data set or a better model or a better computer. It comes from getting constant feedback day in and day out about that ultimately results in a steady improvement of skill instead of a leap forward. But there is that constant relentless progress. As with weather forecasts, we also need to be honest that when we start, our skill is going to leave a lot to be desired. So if we look back at the beginning of this chart, numerical weather forecasts were quite bad when they started. But the only way to get on this learning curve of steady improvement is to start making predictions. We cannot wait until we are good enough at making predictions to make predictions. We will only get good enough by making predictions and learning iteratively. So, part 2, can we do this? So, ultimately, some ecological processes are going to be more predictable than others. So the answer to the question of whether we can make our science more predictive is we need some way of measuring predictability. One important measure of predictability is the limit in time or space at which our predictions are ultimately doing no better than chance. So this is what I'm describing as the forecast limit here. It's a point at which the uncertainty grows till it's no better. If we're lucky, that limit overlaps with time scales and spatial scales that are relevant for making decisions, but there's no guarantee that the scales that we can make predictions on are actually the useful ones. So what determines when we hit this limit? I would argue that it's really determined by the rate at which uncertainty grows from its initial condition, which is really a statement about our ability to measure things right now, to that limit. So that growth rate, that increase of uncertainty in time or space or some other measure of distance like phylogenetic scale or something like that, is going to be ultimately a function of 5 processes labeled here in this function. I'll explain them more right here. So what causes variance in a forecast to increase with time? So there is going to be attributed ultimately to the internal dynamics of the system, the sensitivity of the system to external forcing, our ability to constrain the parameters in any particular model, our ability to quantify and partition out the heterogeneity and variability in ecological systems, what statisticians call random effects. I was really glad that Jessica spent a lot of time talking about that heterogeneity because I think it's really important to ecological predictions. And then the unexplained residual process error, the parts of our current lack of understanding of our systems, as well as kind of the inherent stochasticity in some ecological processes. Now, each of these 5 terms follows a repeating pattern of a sensitivity being multiplied by an uncertainty about that thing. So if we look at that first term as an example of the sensitivity of the system to its internal dynamics, which is known as the stability of the system, and the uncertainty of the system, uncertainty in the current state of the system, or the initial condition uncertainties. If a system is unstable, the sensitivity is bigger than 1, and that causes this uncertainty to grow exponentially because it feeds back on itself. That is exactly the situation that we see in weather forecasting, where the key theoretical insight from Lorenz that the atmosphere is fundamentally chaotic tells us that the key to reducing weather forecast uncertainty, and thus the key to increasing the limit of predictability, is to minimize that initial condition uncertainty. That theoretical insight has had profound implications that has driven 60 years of model development, measurement technology, and tens of billions of dollars each year in sensor networks and satellites. By contrast, in ecology, we're asking questions about predictions and trying to make predictions become more predictive without first figuring out which uncertainty dominates the predictability of our systems. We're rarely even asking the question, even though it has huge implications for our understanding of predictability. And I honestly think that for ecology, that it's not going to be the same as answers for weather. It's not always going to be internal stability. It could be any of those 5 terms. So how do we figure out what it is? It's not, I think it stops becoming a purely theoretical question and becomes an empirical question. And I think it's a really central grand challenge question that cuts across all aspects of our discipline. And to bring back the question Jessica raised, it's the question of whether ecology is more than a collection of case studies, where there's consistent patterns to what systems are predictable, why different systems are predictable. And it's ultimately going to require comparative analyses and syntheses, synthetic analyses, where we put together many studies that is each a puzzle piece that gives us collectively a clear picture of the overall pattern of predictability across the full breadth of our discipline. And to me, this has been really exciting to dive in and thinking about the full breadth of ecology and the commonalities across different systems. And ultimately to start thinking about what are the things that explain the patterns of predictabilities across systems and processes. Been exciting over the last few years to dive into this in a macro systems project that I've been involved in leading, where we're starting by tackling this by spinning up iterative forecasts for a really wide range of different ecological processes. In this case, always leveraging NEON data, so we're limited to freshwater and terrestrial problems, but I think all of this applies to marine as well. So we've got Catherine Wheeler working on phenology forecasts, Katie Zerrato working on forecasts of land surface, carbon and water fluxes, Kathy Weathers leading a team of Gleon students thinking about aquatic productivity, John Foster and Shannon Ledoux making forecasts of ticks, tick-borne disease in small mammal hosts, and a whole team of microbial ecologists making forecasts of the soil microbiome, led by Jenny Bathnagar with Colin Averill and Zoe Werbin working on that. Now, I don't have time. I would love to go into details on all of these because they're really all quite very exciting projects that are all coming along quite well. I'm going to give an example of just one of them to highlight our soil microbial forecasts, where we began by synthesizing data from many different studies to build models about to predict soil microbial communities using metagenomic data compiled from multiple sources, and then build models that made spatial predictions across space and using NEON as a completely separate, independent, truly held out data set as validation. So here, when we look at predictions versus observations in these plots, these are what I would call, true validations. The data was collected by a different team using different methods in different locations than the original data. And I will say we find this a really encouraging set of results because soils are notoriously heterogeneous. You take a soil core at one place, you walk over a couple of feet, take another core, and they'll give you different answers. but we're finding that we have real non-trivial predictive skill. And we're also finding consistent patterns that skill increases with spatial scale when we go from the individual core to the plot to the site. That skill increases as we move up phylogenetic scale for both fungi and bacteria. And we've now kind of moved on to building kind of in an iterative nature, building on those spatial forecasts, the spatial temporal forecasts, and are now running iterative forecasts of the soil microbiome across all of NEON sites for hundreds of different groups. Okay, so in the last part of my talk, I wanted to talk about going beyond individual research to how we make ecology more predictive as a discipline, and that requires building community. So a few years ago, back in 2018, we launched the Ecological Forecasting Initiative with the goal of building an international, interdisciplinary community of practice around ecological forecasting. I want to say a little bit about what FE's been up to. The bulk of FE's activity occurs in a series of working groups, primarily organized around the cross-cutting interdisciplinary challenges shared by members of the forecasting community, regardless of the specific focal systems they're working on. So the working groups aren't terrestrial, aquatic, marine, blah, 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 but they're the shared challenges that we all face. Some of those challenges are technical. So we have a methods and cyber infrastructure group. We have a theory and synthesis working group. We have a social science, decision science working group on the social questions. But most of these are about building community and building capacity. So things like addressing challenges of diversity and education and knowledge transfer. Also note there's a standards group, a student association, and our first international chapter up in Canada. Other things we've done, FE's led to or contributed to a wide range of reports and white papers advocating for the predictive component of the ecological community. And our advocacy has, for example, led to the creation of ESA's Forecasting Award. I'll make a quick plug. The deadline for this year's nominations is just a couple weeks away. FE also maintains relationships with a diverse range of organizational partners committed to the overall growth of our community. FE is also really focused on the bottleneck of training and diversity. So we've run a number of short courses over the years. We've run virtual reading groups, produced series of educational videos in partnerships with NEON. I've produced a book. We're also in the middle of a distributed seminar series on diversity in forecasting and data science more general. There's conversations on diversity and data. And there is that technical side. The iterative prediction really does raise the bar on repeatability and transparency and automation. And this can be a real bottleneck for folks. And it's going to require investment in shared and scalable community tools rather than a plethora of boutique individual solutions. One of the things I'm most excited about these days is that we've just launched this year the NEON Forecasting Challenge. And here, this is an open competition for anyone, not just ecologists, anywhere in the world, students, data scientists, ecologists, whatever, to predict NEON site level observations before they're collected. So the held out data is the future, data that genuinely has not been collected yet. It's open to all participants and approaches. In fact, we've got 3 different university courses that are participating. And it involves data fusion, not just limited to NEON data, but data from any other source and any other network is allowable to help make predictions at NEON sites, provided that it's public and accessible to everyone participating in the challenge. Round 1 is running this year. We hope to run multiple rounds over the next few years. We're doing just year 2 of a RCN. And the current year's forecasts challenges are focused on predicting tick population dynamics, aquatic dissolved oxygen and water temperature, phenocam vegetation phenology, ground beetle biodiversity, and then terrestrial carbon and water fluxes and soil moisture. So that's all I had. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all get involved in making prediction a central part of the future of synthesis.
Great, thank you so much. That was a great overview of a lot of amazing work and initiatives, so thank you. Remind folks to add questions to the Q&A tab. I have one that was put into the chat, so I'll share that while I'm sharing that. Others, if you have questions for either speaker or want to reflect on the earlier talks from this morning, this is a great chance to add those questions. So the question posted to Jessica is, if we define heterogeneity as inter-unit, for example, between patches or individual, and the differences there, and could it be preserved and even effectively used in synthesis of other patterns of interest as a covariate or independent variable as necessary?
Well, yes, it could potentially be used, and it's important to have that kind of data because it might turn out to be useful, but it depends on the nature of the heterogeneity, right? So there are some kinds of interplot, intersite, and so on heterogeneity that are they're due to something that's driving the larger system. For example, you may have a regional species pool, that's driving things that are variable at a smaller spatial scale. So in that case, yes, that might be really valuable when you are trying to synthesize these results across many different local sites or local plots. But it may be completely unique. It may be something that is not shared in any way with anything else, and we don't know why it's different among the different plots or sites and so on, or we know why it's different, but those are conditions that are not replicated anywhere else. So there may be a patch of serpentine soil, or there may be an area where large herbivores are congregating, and that, those kinds of things are not the same in different places. So I guess that's the best I can guess about that.
Great, thanks, Jessica. I'm going to jump in with a question of my own for Mike. I'm curious if you have found a temporal scale at which ecological forecasting works best or begins to break down. Like your weather forecast analogy is an interesting one because no one tries to forecast past about 10 or 15 days at most, usually, because the models are just terrible past that. So have you found a sweet spot of predictability yet, or is that still one of the key questions we're trying to figure out? Oops, you're muted.
Yeah, muted. Yeah, that is definitely an open question, and it's a really hard one. So I will say that some of this timescales of predictability are trivial. Like if I take a soil card today and measure soil carbon, I'm willing to bet that the soil carbon tomorrow is going to be pretty much the same. It's a very slow process. But some of the things that have been interesting is folks have found that we can get legitimate predictability of ecological processes that are driven by weather forecasts on timescales longer than the weather forecasts themselves are judged to be predictable. And I think that's because ecological systems have a lot of time averaging in a lot of processes. And so for example, like the carbon forecasts on a subseasonal to seasonal scale are higher skill than the weather forecasts driving those forecasts, which is really, really encouraging. And at the same time, I think we're seeing a lot of genuine, exciting advances from the Earth system community on advancing the predictability on those seasonal to subseasonal and the interannual to decadal scales. It's a big initiative that's going to be occurring over the next few years, is increasing the predictability of the Earth system as a whole. And I think ecology, what we're working on, fits in very well. In some places as a consumer of that initiatives, in some places as an important feedback to the atmosphere. And I think there's a lot of ecological processes that affect the predictability of the atmosphere and the overall Earth system. But yeah, it's going to be, it's an open question as to where, how long we're going to be able to maintain useful predictions in space and time for different processes. I think doing this kind of with a full uncertainty accounting is pretty new. I mean, I think a lot of previous literature on prediction was a little light on the uncertainty accounting, and so it's hard to synthesize kind of in the ways that I kind of raised in that first principles slide about the different things that affect predictability.
Well, that is a great segue into a question that was just posed, I think, to both of you, which is, how do we communicate model uncertainty in a way that managers and decision makers can understand, while also making our predictions recommendations useful in decision-making processes? I'm curious both of your thoughts on that question. Mike, why don't you go first?
Our experience is it depends a lot on the decision maker. So there are environmental decisions makers out there that are well aware of decision science and aware that there is decades and decades of research on how to make decisions under uncertainty, and that there are formal mathematical ways of taking the uncertainties that come out of these probabilistic forecasts and incorporating them into decisions. And then there are decision makers who just want the mean and want to ignore any uncertainty estimate you give them. So I think, this is part of why I consider what we're doing very interdisciplinary, why we have social scientists and decision scientists involved in FE, is because if it's just, if we use the if you build it, they will come model, this isn't going to work. I was glad to see in a lot of the earlier discussions that questions about stakeholder engagement and diversity of communities was very central to what everyone's thinking about here, because I think that's been exactly what we've been finding as well. Is that, yeah, it really requires co-production of these forecasts with the people who are using them for those uncertainties to get used effectively. But we can point to great examples of decision makers that have embraced a forecasting perspective. The folks at Virginia Tech have the Smart Reservoir project, where they've instrumented a reservoir. They've developed a 2-week forecast of the biophysics of the reservoir, and the decision makers, the reservoir manager, using it on a day-to-day basis. And they trust it to the extent that they actually gave the researchers control of the lake's oxygenation system and allowed them to run some really cool manipulative experiments, that they were actually forecasting the manipulative experiments too, not just the status quo.
Cool. Jessica?
I don't know nearly as much about this as Michael, you do, and I have to say your talk was super interesting. I haven't thought about forecasting on these small temporal scales. That's really, really intriguing. I think one of the things there are a number of things that separate scientific thinking from the way that people who are not trained in science think. And one of those is how you consider, how you think about, how you take into account uncertainty. And I think this is a huge barrier. It's a huge problem, not just with managers, but with the general public. The idea of accepting that there's uncertainty and making decisions in light of uncertainty seems to be just a huge barrier and a very difficult thing to explain, and something that makes people who are not trained in scientific thinking, who don't think about probability, it makes them very uncomfortable, it makes them angry, it makes them upset. But I'll give an example of something that seems like a good approach, which is working directly with stakeholders in particular cases, and where a particular decision is required, to have them work towards what kinds of answers they're looking for. And I think that in those cases, they may not say we need absolute certainty without any possibility of failure, that if they're working towards those questions and they're working directly with scientists, which sounds a little bit like what you were talking about, Michael, that seems like a more successful approach. One example of this is I have very recently been working with climate scientists and ecologists on climate intervention and what are the implications of geoengineering for ecological systems. And there is a group that's called the Decimals Group, where they have stakeholders in developing countries working on what they would like to know about and what kinds of information they want in order to make decisions and to have input from the perspective of these stakeholders in developing countries about geoengineering. It's a really, really interesting approach. And I think they have at least a dozen different countries that have these decimals groups. So very interesting stuff. I don't know though, it seems like it is a big divide between people who have extensive scientific training, who think a lot about probability and things like type 1 and type 2 errors. I just think about the world that way. And if you haven't been immersed in that kind of thinking for a long time, it's a really uncomfortable way of thinking about things.
Thanks. That was really, really insightful. I have another question. This is posed mostly to you, Jessica, but Michael, feel free to respond as well. So the question is, how much do you think the robustness of meta-analysis results and global predictions from them might suffer from the lack of results from non-English peer-reviewed results? So basically, how much of a bias do you think we're getting from the literature that we are drawing from, or is there not likely a bias? Do you have a sense of that?
Oh, I think there's a huge bias. Yeah. I had one publication that we worked on where we looked at where the predictions are coming from, where the information is coming from. I had so much fun. I had a lab group where people were different native speakers from different languages. And we looked at literature from the CNKI database, which is Chinese language. And we looked at some African databases, and it's complicated because the questions that people are asking and the nature of the data that they're collecting are very different in these from these different countries and from these different languages. We didn't look at Spanish, which would have been really good. So a lot of science is published in English now, but there are all sorts of biases. So one of the things there are a lot of interesting biases in science in general and in meta-analysis as well. People are continually worried about publication bias, where papers are not published because they don't show statistical significance. And that is an issue, and it's more of an issue in some things than others. But for a long time, I've been thinking that what's much more interesting is research bias. So not only whether things are published in different languages, but what are the things we look at? What are we looking for? If we want to understand the natural world, well, we don't have the information to understand the natural world. We have a lot of information on loblolly pines, and a lot of information on honeybees and some butterflies and, a few other things, and very little information on the vast diversity of living things and living systems and places. There are so many places that are heavily researched, and other places where there's been one study that you can find back in 1965, and that's it. Who knows what else is going on there? So there are many different kinds of biases, and the language bias is one of them, but there are many different kinds of research bias that are problematic if what we really are aiming to do is to understand the natural world.
Mike, do you have any thoughts on that, or?
That it's a real problem, and when we think about building the prediction community, it's also a major issue of equity, that the places that most need this information are the places that are most data limited and where we haven't built the same infrastructure. it's something we're aware of, but there's definitely not something we have a silver bullet to solve.
Well, it seems like part of the way systems, well, maybe a big part of the way systems work is the way that people interact with the systems. And there's bound to be all sorts of cultural or spatial variation in that. And if your forecasting models are built on parameters or estimates that come from one place, they may do poorly in other places. And so it seems like, really figuring that out would be a key part of the ability of forecasting to work in different places.
Yeah, and that part, the heterogeneity part, is kind of why why that first principles derivation definitely has heterogeneity and variability built into it. I definitely think it's, I've off the record said that I suspect that's going to be the dominant source of uncertainty for many ecological processes. But on the flip side, I also don't think that uncertainty is unbound. I mean, that's the whole idea of a statistical random effect, is you put bounds on the variance that you have across sites or across time or something the limitation, I think, of site scale research is you look at something at one site, you look at another site, and it feels like that difference between sites is unbound. And it's the challenge of getting enough sampling to understand what the limits of that variability are, and then, as Jessica alluded to, chipping away at it, figuring out what processes explain that variability, so it doesn't just become an unaccounted for variance, but becomes part of our process understanding.
Great. So just had a question come in response to that response. It says, how many sites do you need to estimate the boundedness?
That's a stats 101 question. How many samples do you need to get a stable estimate of a variance?
Yeah.
Different opinion, 10, 30, it depends on who you're talking to and how much variability you see.
Yeah, it depends where it levels off, right? Like
Yep.
if you draw a curve and it leveled off, probably you're okay until you get to the next step and it starts going up again.
Okay, another question to both of you. A theme that emerged in our breakout group questions that has also been a theme in both of your talks is synthesis of process and synthesis of patterns. And where do you think synthesis of processes and synthesis of patterns should converge to best enhance predictability in ecology?
I mean, this is, in some ways, this is the classic question of how much can we infer process from pattern. I think it's a longstanding question. I mean, my ultimate interest is in trying to understand the underlying process, not just being able to replicate the pattern. I don't know if I really have much more to add to that now.
I don't know either. I think, well, when does it matter? Is process important for understanding and predicting pattern, or maybe it's not? Maybe we could do pretty well with just pattern. If that's the case, if we could do pretty well with pattern, maybe the answers we want are more pattern and process is more like a kind of esoteric thing that is very satisfying if you know it. But I think that, some of this is how much can we get away with, right?
Yeah. All right, we're going to take one more question that was posted and then shift into the wrap up. Unless you just have a burning question out there, someone please feel free to, of course, post it and we will get to it for sure. But this question, last one came in, is assuming we are limited in where we can put effort, where do you think we will see the biggest payoff in forecasting and meta-analysis? Is it longer time series, finer time series, filling in the spatial gaps of where data are gathered, or something else?
Oh, I would say better reporting. Like, let's get everybody on the same, on the same ship here. Like, everybody wants to do things in their own way. Everybody is doing things, and it's just, missing data and data that's poorly reported and metadata that's impossible to understand. And let's standardize a little bit, which sounds like an anathema to ecologists. But if we can have better data reporting, it doesn't really take more money or more time or more anything. And then we can use meta-analysis and forecasting and all of these different kinds of analyses to see where the important gaps are. I think we don't even know where the important gaps are because we can't judge what the information we have is.
I agree with all of that. And the thing that I would add, which is also kind of a punt because it's not choosing any of the three options, is to say often I think I find is that we're limited by sufficient process detail. So I've done a lot of work on the carbon cycle, and there's often a few types of data that are in huge abundance. Like we have petabytes of remote sensing. We have, thousands of site years worth of eddy covariance data. And each of these things, these big data sources all tell you, they give you a lot of information about part of the problem, but there's no one data set that tells you the complete set of interactions within the system. And it's kind of the long tail of data, the stuff that is challenging to get and pull together, that requires the grunt work of synthesis, is often where the pieces that connect the big data together are hiding. And I find, for example, I participated in one synthesis effort across, bringing models and eddy flux data together at the same time that I actually participated years ago in an NCEAS working group doing synthesis on the FACE experiments, the free air CO2 enrichment experiments. The latter one was much smaller data, and I think we learned a lot more because we had a more complete understanding of the process, because they measured the bejesus out of all aspects of that system rather than giving me, more data than I could handle on one aspect of the system.
I would add one other thing to that, which is there's so much emphasis now on big data, NEON, and all these kind of things. And it's all, and remote sensing, it's all observational data. And when you have observational data, you've got confounding. And so it's both the links are sometimes missing, and a lot of times what you're looking for is confounded. So, where some things always go together, so you can't separate them. So then you can't infer process, you can't even really understand the nature of the pattern, because, and some things are impossible to separate. There were many things, especially at very large spatial scales, where there's no way to separate them and to separate the confounded factors, because we only have one planet. So, there's, we don't know. But the role of, it's really interesting to balance out the role of experimental work and the role of all of these very elaborate and sophisticated measurements, which are observational data nevertheless. Then you can't get around the confounding usually, or most of the time you can't. So I think thinking back on, there was the heyday of experimental ecology. We still have a lot of experiments, but the emphasis now is on really big data sets that are collected with equipment, with remote sensing, with things like that. And thinking back on what, where can we use manipulative experiments to separate out confounding factors and to look at these connections between things, I think we need to look back at that. I think those are still valuable approaches.
All right.
If I can get one quick thought in there also, Ben, on the note of longer time series, longer time series are invaluable. I would never say they aren't, with risk of being tarred and feathered by my LTR colleagues. But I also want to say that one shouldn't feel limited in learning to make forecasts by not having long time series, because you have this iterative learning process. You can start with very, very simple models at the beginning and improve those over time, that we shouldn't let a lack of long time series prohibit us from starting to make predictions.
I actually think that's a key strategy, because from what you were talking about earlier, Mike, is, knowing the how to do forecasting depends on the scales at which things are operating. Your soil carbon example, like getting more finer resolution temporal data on soil carbon for every minute or every hour isn't going to improve your understanding of the system. And so some things have understanding the scales at which processes are acting and what are the key drivers, then allows you to figure out where your most valuable monitoring and measuring will happen, or experimental work to uncover those processes. So it has to be a bit of an interaction between understanding the processes and the dynamics that regulate things and where you're going to be most effective at monitoring things to improve your models. So I don't think you can answer it. Emilio is booing and hissing us for not answering the question directly in the chat. But I actually think it's going to be the classic scientific, it depends, right? Because you need to know more about the system before you can answer that question.
Yeah, one of the things that we've done a good bit of work on is using models and predictions to inform what the next most valuable data sets are. And all the students that I have that are working on these iterative forecast projects have all been told, synthesize the data that we already have in hand and let that tell you where the gaps are, rather than going out and collecting the data first and then building the model around it. We've kind of turned what I think many of us did in our dissertations on its head, of doing synthesis first and then data collection second.
All right. Well, that was a really great discussion. Great questions from folks. Thanks for those. And today we had more talks than breakout sessions. Tomorrow is a lot more. We have a couple more great talks, but a lot more breakout sessions. So thanks everyone for bringing your energy and your enthusiasm to today, and your attention to the speakers for really great talks that I think were really inspiring for us as we think about the questions that we face. Tomorrow we're going to focus a lot on our collective efforts of understanding how synthesis science is uniquely suited to address these large ecological questions that we're facing. Save some mental and creative energy for tomorrow. We're going to have, I think, a lot of fun diving deep into all that. For now, we're going to wrap up a few minutes early with the formal part of the workshop, the structured part, to give everyone a little space to unwind, but really encourage you to shift over to the lounge, go into breakout rooms in the lounge, and take advantage of the chance to meet more of the folks in this community that are here. Keep the discussions going if you feel inspired to do that, or just talk about what you had for lunch or dinner today if you want to do that, just to get to know each other. And a reminder that tomorrow morning we'll reconvene at 9 a.m. West Coast time of the US, Pacific Standard Time, for some more virtual coffee and chatting before we start up the formal agenda at 9:30. So really encourage you to take advantage of these chances. If we were in person, we would all be standing in the lounge or the hallway, getting to know each other more. And we want to try to capture and recreate as much of that as we can in this virtual space. So just a final thank you to everyone for your energy and attention. And please shift over to the lounge and get to know a few folks. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow at the start of the session.
Just to let everybody know, I did put the lounge link into the chat, but you can also go to KikoChat, go to your home page and click on the lounge if you are hoping to get there. Or again, I just put the link in the chat here. So we'll see you over in the lounge if you want to network with us.